As of March 1st, 2025, Iran sits on what analysts estimate is the largest ballistic missile stockpile in the entire Middle East. Over 3,000 missiles covering different ranges and carrying different payloads, some of them precise enough to target a specific building in a city. But here's the question almost no major outlet is asking directly right now. And it is more important than any of the hardware. The man who personally oversaw the building of that entire arsenal over more than 3 decades, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, is 85 years old. And in the past 18 months, the system around him has absorbed a level of shock that would have broken most governments in this region. Iran's president died in a helicopter crash. Its foreign minister died in the same crash. Senior IRGC commanders were eliminated in strikes attributed to Israel. And in October 2024, Israeli aircraft struck Iranian territory directly, something that had never happened in the Islamic Republic's entire modern history. Each of those events alone would force any serious government to openly recalibrate its posture. Together, they represent something structurally different. Together, they describe a system under sustained pressure at the exact moment it faces its most consequential unresolved question: what happens when Khamenei is gone? Not if, when. That distinction matters far more than most mainstream analysis currently acknowledges, and it is worth saying clearly out loud. Because this is not a question about whether Iran's missiles disappear after him. They will not disappear. The infrastructure is buried, distributed, and hardened. The real question is, who controls those 3,000 plus missiles after Khamenei? And does that person see the world the same way he does? That is the most consequential and underreported strategic uncertainty in the Middle East right now, and it does not have a clean answer yet. To understand why, you have to understand what Khamenei actually built, not just the missiles themselves, but the command architecture deliberately constructed around them. And you have to understand why that architecture was specifically designed so that no single person can fully control it alone. That was not an accident, it was a deliberate structural choice. The IRGC, or the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is not a conventional military. It is a parallel state inside a state with its own navy, air force, missile command, and economic empire. By most serious estimates, the IRGC controls or influences somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of Iran's entire formal economy through affiliated companies and financial foundations. That financial independence is structural, not incidental. It means the IRGC does not fully depend on the civilian government's budget to function or to sustain its operations. And the missile program, the IRGC Aerospace Force, sits inside that structure, commanded since 2010 by General Amir Ali Hajizadeh. Hajizadeh is not a background figure. He personally oversaw the 2020 strike on Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq, the largest Iranian ballistic missile attack against U.S. forces in history. He gave public statements after that strike that were notable for one specific quality. He said Iran had accepted the possibility of American retaliation before the missiles were launched. That is not the language of a commander waiting for permission from a clerical oversight council. That is someone who treats missile use as an operational tool, not a measure of absolute last resort. In my view, understanding what Hajizadeh actually believes, not his official public statements, but his operational doctrine, is one of the most underanalyzed questions in the current strategic environment. Because if Khamenei's personal authority is what currently keeps the missile program calibrated within certain limits, then the question of who replaces that authority is not procedural. It is deeply consequential. Let's go back to May 2024, the Raisi helicopter crash, because that event is significantly more important strategically than most coverage treated it at the time. Ebrahim Raisi was not just a president filling an administrative role. By multiple credible accounts, he was the leading internal candidate to eventually become the next supreme leader. He was a cleric with a hardline record, institutional loyalty from inside the IRGC, and Khamenei's visible public endorsement built over years of positioning in senior roles. That succession pathway, cultivated carefully and quietly over years, ended in a mountain fog bank near the Azerbaijan border on a single afternoon in May 2024. What replaced it was not a clean alternative plan. What replaced it was open competition between factions inside a system that officially does not acknowledge having factions at all. 3 months after Raisi died, Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh was killed in Tehran, inside the Iranian capital, inside a guest residence used for official state visits. The location matters as much as the act itself. It was not a border incident. It was not a battlefield strike. It was a demonstration that Iran's most secure internal geography had been penetrated. For a government whose legitimacy is built partly on projecting invulnerability, that was not just a security failure, it was a visible crack in the image the system depends on. And then came October 2024. Israeli airstrikes directly on Iranian territory. Air defense radar systems and missile production infrastructure hit across multiple locations inside the country. Iran's public response was restrained. Officials described it as a deliberate strategic choice. That may be accurate, but it also revealed something about internal constraints at that specific moment. A government that absorbs a presidential death, a capital assassination, and a direct territorial strike, all within 5 months, and still chooses restraint is signaling something about its internal condition. Whether that signal is strategic confidence or internal constraint is not a trivial distinction. It is arguably the central analytical question for understanding what comes next, because the answer to that question determines what 3,000 plus missiles actually mean in the post-Khamenei period, a managed deterrent or something structurally less predictable. What this suggests is that we are in a window right now where the gap between what Iran projects publicly and what is actually happening inside its decision-making structure may be historically wide. The last time Iran faced this question was 1989. Khamenei died after a long illness. The constitution had to be rewritten in his final weeks to make the succession legally possible at all. Khamenei was not the obvious candidate. He lacked the religious rank the original system required. The rules were changed specifically to accommodate him. It was institutional improvisation under pressure. That transition held, but it held in a system that had never done it before, through last-minute changes, with no established playbook and enormous uncertainty about who actually controlled what. The question worth sitting with right now is whether the system built since 1989 is genuinely prepared for the next transition, or whether the preparation is mostly procedural on paper, while the real power dynamics underneath it remain entirely unresolved. That question does not have a comfortable answer, and the analysts in Washington, Jerusalem, and Riyadh who are paid to think about it are not waiting passively for one to emerge. Drop a comment right now. Do you think Iran's missile command stays unified after Khamenei? Or does the IRGC break from clerical control entirely? I read every comment, and on this one, I genuinely want your read. If this kind of layered analysis is why you come to this channel, hit the like button right now. It helps more people find this when the stakes are this high. Because in the next section, we're going inside the actual architecture of the missile program. Not the official version, but where these weapons physically sit, how command flows day to day, who signs off, and why the system was deliberately designed so that no single person can authorize a launch alone. Stay with me. The architecture that answers that question was built with a very specific purpose in mind, and it tells you everything. Here is something the U.S. Department of Defense confirmed in open congressional testimony, but that almost no mainstream coverage has connected to the succession question directly. Iran's missile launch authority does not flow through the president. It does not flow through this cabinet. It flows through one office and one office only, the supreme leader. That single fact changes everything about what happens to 3,000 plus missiles the moment that office becomes vacant or contested. Because right now, the man who sits inside the IRGC Aerospace Force command structure, General Amir Ali Hajizadeh, has operated under Khamenei's direct authority for 15 consecutive years, not through a chain of bureaucratic approvals, not through a civilian oversight committee, through a direct operational relationship with the supreme leader that bypassed much of the formal government structure entirely. In my view, that is the most important structural detail in this entire story, and almost no public analysis has treated it with the weight it deserves. Let's go directly to what Hajizadeh actually controls, because the public description of the IRGC Aerospace Force significantly understates what the organization has become since 2010. When Hajizadeh took command, the Aerospace Force had a capable but regionally limited ballistic missile program, ranges measured in hundreds of kilometers, accuracy measured in hundreds of meters of error. By 2025, the picture is structurally different. The Shahab series gave way to the Ahmad, the Ghadr, and eventually the Fateh, Iran's first publicly acknowledged hypersonic missile, tested in 2023. The Fateh's stated range is 1,400 kilometers, with a claimed terminal velocity of Mach 13. Independent analysts have not fully verified those figures, but the test was real, filmed, and officially announced by the IRGC. What changed under Hajizadeh was not just the hardware, it was the doctrine. The Aerospace Force shifted toward what Iranian military publications openly described as an active response capability. The distinction matters. Deterrence means you build missiles to prevent an attack. Active response capability means you build missiles with specific targets already assigned and rehearsed. The January 2020 al-Assad strike was the first public demonstration of that doctrine in operation. 12 Qiyam missiles launched in 2 waves, targeted with enough precision to hit specific hangars on a U.S. base while deliberately avoiding American personnel casualties. That deliberate calibration, hitting infrastructure, not people, was not improvised. It was rehearsed, and it reflected a command structure that had worked through exactly what it wanted to communicate and how. Hajizadeh said publicly afterward that the strike was a message, not a maximum effort. Iran had deliberately held back most of its available response capacity. Whether that claim was accurate or rhetorical, it tells you something precise about how this specific commander thinks. in terms of calibrated escalation, not maximum force. That mindset, measuring what a strike communicates, not just what it destroys, is the exact operational logic currently running the IRGC aerospace force from the inside. Now here is where the succession question intersects with the command architecture in a way that most outside analysis is not fully engaging with yet. Khamenei's authority over the missile program is not just formal, it is relational, built over decades through trusted intermediaries and channels that exist entirely outside the written institutional structure. When Khamenei approves or restrains an operation, it is not through a formal documented chain. It runs through personal relationships built over 30-plus years of working together inside the same closed system. That kind of system does not transfer automatically to a successor. It does not come with a procedural manual. It has to be rebuilt, and rebuilding it takes time that a succession crisis may not provide. In my view, this is the specific vulnerability that outside governments are most focused on right now, not the missiles themselves, the gap between the current relational authority structure and whatever replaces it. Let's talk about who is actually positioned to replace Khamenei, because the official answer and the real answer are not the same thing. And the gap between them is where the strategic uncertainty lives. The official mechanism is the Assembly of Experts, an 88-member clerical body with the constitutional authority to select the next supreme leader after Khamenei's death or incapacitation. The names that serious Iran analysts identify as genuine candidates for supreme leader fall into two broad categories. And the difference between those categories is directly relevant to the missile question. The first category is clerical succession, someone from the religious establishment who would maintain the theological legitimacy of the Wilayat al-Faqih system that Khomeini designed and Khamenei has embodied. The leading name in this category, cited by multiple credible sources including the Wilson Center and Carnegie Endowment analyses published through 2024, is Mojtaba Khamenei, the supreme leader's own son. Mojtaba Khamenei is in his mid-50s. He holds a mid-level clerical rank that would normally disqualify him, just as his father's rank was considered insufficient in 1989 before the Constitution was adjusted. His name surfaces in analyst reports not because of his public profile, deliberately minimal, but because of his documented role in IRGC political liaison functions going back to 2009. During the Green Movement protests, the crackdown was coordinated through channels that multiple credible reports linked to Mojtaba's direct involvement. The second category is what analysts describe as a military-clerical hybrid. Strong IRGC backing combined with just enough religious credential to satisfy the formal constitutional requirements. The name most frequently cited in this context is Ibrahim Raisi's replacement trajectory. Not Raisi himself, who is gone, but the type of figure he represented. Hardline, institutionally loyal, IRGC aligned. Here is where this connects directly back to the missile question. These two paths, clerical continuity versus military-clerical hybrid, imply meaningfully different relationships with Hajizade's command structure. A purely clerical successor would need to establish authority over Hajizade's network from outside it. That creates a consolidation period with no guaranteed or predictable timeline. A military-clerical hybrid would have existing IRGC relationships, but might also treat the missile program as a direct policy instrument rather than a deterrent to be managed with careful restraint. Neither scenario is straightforwardly stable from the perspective of outside governments trying to model Iranian behavior in the first months after a transition. There is a third possibility most public analysis underweights, that no clean succession occurs at all, and what follows is a genuine factional competition between the IRGC and the clerical establishment lasting months. Iran has mechanisms designed to prevent that outcome. The Supreme National Security Council can exercise emergency authority. IRGC commanders have historically shown discipline in deferring to the formal clerical process even when they disagreed internally. None of those mechanisms has ever been tested under genuine external military pressure simultaneously with an internal succession crisis. The closest real comparison is 1989, and that transition happened during a ceasefire, not an active standoff with carrier groups in the region. What this suggests is that the structural risk is not primarily about any successor's ideology. It is about the window of ambiguity between Khamenei's death and the consolidation of whoever replaces him. Not because anyone inside the structure would necessarily act recklessly, but because external actors might choose to move precisely when Iranian decision-making is hardest to read. Israel's deterrent strategy toward Iran has always been calibrated around a clear read of Khamenei's personal risk tolerance and his specific boundaries for escalation. A period where that tolerance is genuinely unknown, renegotiated during a contested succession, is a fundamentally different and harder to model strategic environment to operate in. In my view, this is the specific scenario that intelligence communities in Tel Aviv, Washington, and Riyadh are modeling most seriously right now. Not a conventional war with Iran, the window. In the next section, we are going inside the missiles themselves, what Iran actually has where it is positioned, and why the geographic distribution was deliberately designed with internal uncertainty in mind. Because the physical architecture of the program tells you something important about how its builders thought about continuity, and that architecture is more sophisticated than most public coverage suggests. Right now, as of March 1st, 2025, one man holds more direct operational authority over Iran's missile arsenal than anyone else in the country outside of Khamenei himself. His name is Brigadier General Amir Ali Hajizadeh. And the question of what his authority actually looks like on the ground, in practice, not on paper, is the answer the title of this video has been building toward. Here is what most coverage gets wrong about how Iran's missile command actually functions. It is not a top-down hierarchy where orders travel cleanly from the supreme leader down to a launch crew. It is a distributed network, deliberately fragmented, designed so that no single point of failure, whether a leadership vacuum, an enemy strike, or an internal power struggle, can neutralize the system as a whole. That design choice was not accidental. It was the direct lesson drawn from watching Iraq's military collapse in 1991 and 2003, a system where physical infrastructure, command authority, and launch capability are deliberately dispersed across geography, across institutions, and across multiple layers of built-in redundancy. The IRGC Aerospace Force operates from a network of facilities that Western defense analysts estimate includes more than a dozen hardened underground complexes spread across multiple provinces. These are not storage depots. They are fully functional launch facilities cut into mountain rock, each with its own power generation, communications, infrastructure, and crew quarters for extended independent operation. Based on open-source satellite imagery and Iranian state media disclosures, the most significant facilities are concentrated in 3 geographic clusters. In the west near the Iraqi border, in the south near the Strait of Hormuz, and in the northeast near the Turkmenistan frontier. That geographic distribution is not random. Each cluster covers a different threat axis and a different set of potential targets. What this means in practice is that destroying Iran's missile capability would require simultaneous, successful strikes on more than a dozen hardened underground targets spread across a country roughly the size of Alaska. No single airstrike campaign, even a sustained one, has ever successfully neutralized a distributed underground missile network of this scale. Now here is the command layer sitting on top of that physical infrastructure. And this is where Hajizadeh's specific authority becomes visible in concrete terms. The IRGC Aerospace Force is divided into distinct operational commands, each corresponding to one of those 3 geographic clusters described above. Each command has its own senior officer, communications chain, and standing orders built to function independently even if contact with Tehran is severed. Those standing orders, what analysts call pre-delegated authority, define the conditions under which a regional commander can authorize a launch without waiting for direct approval from Tehran. The specific thresholds for pre-delegated authority are not publicly known, but the existence of pre-delegation itself has been confirmed indirectly. Multiple former IRGC commanders have referenced it, and assessments from the International Institute for Strategic Studies have addressed the concept directly. What pre-delegation means in a succession scenario is critical. If Khamenei dies and the succession process enters a contested or unclear phase, regional missile commanders do not simply sit idle waiting for new orders. They operate under standing instructions written and approved before any succession event, instructions that reflect Khamenei's doctrine as it existed when written, not the doctrine of whoever eventually replaces him. In my view, this is the most underappreciated structural feature of Iran's missile command. The arsenal does not pause during a succession. It continues operating under the last authorized set of instructions until new authority is formally established and communicated down the entire chain. That continuity is a feature, not a bug, from Iran's perspective. It means the deterrent remains credible even during internal political instability, but it also means the missile posture during a succession window reflects decisions Khamenei made years earlier, not decisions being made in real time by whoever holds power in that moment. Now let's put specific numbers on the arsenal itself, because the public picture is significantly more detailed than most coverage suggests. According to CSIS assessments published through early 2025, Iran's operational ballistic missile inventory includes 4 primary systems that matter most for the current strategic picture. The Shahab-3 and its derivatives represent the largest portion of the stockpile by volume, ranges of 300 to 2,000 kilometers depending on variant. The EMAD is the precision upgrade. Same basic range as the Shahab-3, but with a maneuvering re-entry vehicle that changes its accuracy profile entirely. Its estimated circular error probable is around 500 meters, compared to several kilometers for the older Shahab variants. That difference matters significantly for targeting specific infrastructure. The Ghadar 110 extends the range further to approximately 1,800 to 2,000 kilometers and carries a payload capable of reaching targets across the entire Middle East from launch sites well inside Iranian territory. And then there's the Fatah, publicly tested in 2023, officially described by the IRGC as Iran's first operational hypersonic missile, claimed range of 1,400 kilometers. The maneuvering glide vehicle presents a fundamentally different intercept problem for missile defense systems than any of the earlier ballistic designs. The significance of the Fatah is not its range. Israel, Saudi Arabia, and U.S. bases throughout the region are already within range of Iran's older systems. The significance is the trajectory. A hypersonic glide vehicle does not follow the predictable ballistic arc that existing missile defense radars are optimized to track. Arrow 3, THAAD, and Patriot were all engineered around ballistic trajectory physics, and a maneuvering hypersonic vehicle changes the intercept geometry in ways those systems were not designed to handle. The US and Israel are actively developing countermeasures against hypersonic threats. That work is real and seriously funded. But as of early 2025, no publicly confirmed operational system deployed in the region has demonstrated reliable intercept capability against a maneuvering hypersonic vehicle. That gap between what Iran can now put in the air and what regional missile defense systems can reliably intercept is the specific capability change that Hajizadeh has overseen during his 15 years in command. In 2010, Iran's missiles were numerous but largely predictable. In 2025, a portion of that arsenal presents an intercept challenge that no regional defense architecture has fully solved. Now, let's bring this back to the control question directly, because the physical arsenal and the command architecture together define what who controls it actually means in operational terms. Hajizadeh controls the day-to-day operational posture. He controls the readiness levels, the targeting assignments, the maintenance cycles, and the training of the personnel who operate these systems. What Hajizadeh does not directly control is the authorization threshold, the decision to formally move from deterrence posture to active strike operations against a specific target. That requires Supreme Leader authorization. It is a structural line that has not shifted in 30 years of the Islamic Republic's history. That threshold is the most consequential variable in the succession question. Whoever holds authority after Khamenei sets it for the first time under new conditions with no precedent to draw on. And that person will be making that decision without the 3 decades of institutional experience and calibrated judgment that Khamenei accumulated. They will be making it at a moment when every government in the region is watching closely for signals about exactly where the new threshold sits. In my view, that first test of the new Supreme Leader's authorization threshold, whatever form it takes, will be the most closely watched single event in Middle East strategic affairs in the years after the transition. Not because war is inevitable, but because the gap between the old threshold and the new one, in either direction, defines the stability or instability of an entirely new strategic era. In the next section, we're going to look at the external dimension of this. How Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States are each positioning themselves in response to exactly this uncertainty. Each of those 3 governments reads the succession risk differently, and the positioning choices they are making right now are already reshaping the regional architecture regardless of who fills Khamenei's seat. Stay with me. The external positioning happening right now, before the transition, may matter as much as the transition itself. Here is what almost no mainstream outlet will say directly. All 3 governments most threatened by Iran's arsenal are already acting as if the transition has begun. They are not waiting for Khamenei to die. They are not waiting for a successor to be named. The positioning decisions are being made right now, while the current structure is still standing. And each of those 3 governments, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United States, has a fundamentally different read on what the succession window represents and what they need to do before it opens. Understanding those 3 reads is the most important analytical frame for anyone trying to follow what actually happens in the Middle East over the next 5 to 10 years. Let's start with Israel, because Israel's calculation is the most direct and the most consequential for the near-term trajectory of events. Israel's strategic doctrine toward Iran has always rested on 2 core conditions: prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, and prevent any regional actor from achieving strategic conventional superiority. The missile program sits at the intersection of both conditions. A large, precise, partially hypersonic arsenal in hostile hands is exactly what Israel's doctrine is designed to prevent from consolidating. For the past decade, Israel's primary tool against that capability has been what analysts call systematic degradation, covert operations targeting missile scientists, production facilities, and logistics chains. The results of that campaign are a matter of genuine debate. Iranian missile capability continued to grow despite sustained Israeli pressure over more than 10 years of covert operations. What changed significantly in October 2024 was the shift from covert degradation to an overt direct strike on Iranian territory. Israeli aircraft hit air defense radars and missile-related infrastructure inside Iran. That was a threshold crossed deliberately. The message was not about the physical damage caused, which was real but limited. It was about demonstrating the capability to operate openly inside Iranian airspace. In my view, that strike was calibrated toward the succession scenario, establishing before the transition that Israeli military action inside Iran is viable and will not automatically trigger a full regional war. The precedent matters enormously during a succession window, when an incoming supreme leader is still establishing their own red lines, and every government in the region is reading their risk tolerance carefully. An incoming supreme leader who has already seen Israeli strikes on Iranian soil go largely unanswered faces a fundamentally different first test than one who has not. Now let's look at Saudi Arabia, because the Saudi calculation is less visible in Western media but arguably more structurally important for the long-term regional architecture. Saudi Arabia's relationship with Iran is the foundational axis of Middle East geopolitics. The Riyadh-Tehran rivalry shapes proxy dynamics in Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria simultaneously. For decades, Saudi strategic planning operated under one foundational assumption: Iran was a permanent adversary with a stable, if hostile, government whose decision-making was relatively predictable. The succession question disrupts that assumption in a specific way. Even a brief period of genuine Iranian internal instability creates unpredictability in the proxy theaters where both countries compete most actively. The Houthi movement in Yemen is the clearest example. Houthi military capability, particularly drones and missiles, has been built substantially through IRGC supply chains, requiring continuous coordination. A succession crisis in Tehran that disrupts those coordination channels even temporarily creates operational uncertainty for Houthi forces that Saudi Arabia would view as a strategic opening rather than a risk. In my view, this is the scenario Riyadh is quietly modeling. Not a hot war with Iran during the succession window, but a recalibration of proxy dynamics where Iranian coordination is weakened by internal disruption. Saudi Arabia's 2023 normalization agreement with Iran, brokered by China, created a diplomatic channel that did not previously exist, a tool for communication during a transition period that Riyadh did not have before. That combination, a direct diplomatic channel, quiet proxy recalibration, and military modernization financed by oil revenues, describes Saudi Arabia's current posture more accurately than any single headline captures. Now, let's look at the United States, because the American calculation involves the most variables and the most direct connection to the nuclear question. Washington's primary concern regarding the succession is not the conventional missile arsenal. The U.S. has missile defense architecture and forward-deployed forces capable of operating in the region on short notice. Washington's primary concern is what a new supreme leader decides to do with Iran's nuclear program in the first months after taking power. Iran's nuclear program has been the central axis of U.S.-Iran relations for more than 2 decades. The JCPOA, the 2018 withdrawal, the enrichment buildup since 2019, all within Khamenei's personal strategic calculus. That calculus has been consistent for 4 decades. Never cross the threshold to an actual weapon, maintain enrichment as leverage, and use the program as a negotiating instrument rather than a genuine weapons effort. A new supreme leader is not bound by that calculus. They arrive with their own political debts, their own factional pressures, and their own read on what Iran's strategic position requires. The specific concern in Washington is that a new supreme leader, particularly one who rose through the IRGC, might read the succession moment as an opportunity to accelerate the nuclear program, not necessarily toward a weapon immediately, but toward a threshold position that makes the eventual decision easier and faster than anything Khamenei's calibrated approach ever permitted. According to IAEA reports published through 2024, Iran has accumulated enough 60% enriched uranium that the time required to reach weapons-grade enrichment has compressed significantly compared to 2018. The Arms Control Association assessed that, under certain scenarios, that timeline has narrowed from months to weeks, a technical backdrop against which any succession scenario now plays out. What this means practically is that a new supreme leader wanting to signal strength and consolidate IRGC support has a technical option available that Khamenei chose not to exercise for 4 decades. The Biden administration's final months were characterized by renewed focus on Iranian nuclear diplomacy, not because a deal was imminent, but because the succession window changes the negotiating landscape. A pre-transition agreement locks in Khamenei's calibrated approach before a successor can redefine it. That logic has carried forward into the early Trump administration period in 2025. In my view, the missile question and the nuclear question are the same question. The arsenal is the delivery system, the nuclear program is the payload, and the succession is the moment both become simultaneously open. The strategic architecture around Iran is being restructured. Israeli positioning, Saudi recalibration, American nuclear focus, all anticipatory, all built around a transition every analyst treats as near term. None of these 3 governments is waiting for Khamenei to die. They are building positions and making structural investments now, while the current system is still stable enough to allow deliberate action. The active phase of external positioning has already begun. The transition itself has not yet begun. And that gap is where the most consequential decisions of the next decade are quietly being made, not in press conferences or Security Council sessions, in targeting databases, succession modeling exercises, proxy supply chains, and enrichment calculations that will shape this region for the next generation. The largest missile arsenal in the Middle East has a commander today. It has a doctrine today. It has an authorization structure that has been stable for more than 3 decades. What it does not have is a guaranteed answer to the question of who holds that authorization structure tomorrow and what they decide to do with it on the first morning they wake up holding it alone. That uncertainty is not a crisis yet, but it is the most consequential open question in Middle East strategic affairs right now, and every government with serious assets in the region is already answering it.